Hi, and welcome back to DonorLove. I'm Jessica, and we are here to help you build better donor relations. This week, we are specifically talking about grant writing. I'm here with Melanie from MK Accounting. She's here to share with us how to efficiently track your financials once you are awarded the grant. Implementing a system for your financials will allow your grantor more easily to say yes when you ask them for future funding. Melanie has 10 plus years of experience with nonprofits, including SafeHaven of Tarrant County, where we actually may have ran into each other because I did some work for them through an agency, and Girls Inc. and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So I'll put it over to you, Melanie. And you have this PowerPoint, right?
Yes. Yeah, can you give me control?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Thank y'all for having me today. Meeting.
Okay, you are the host.
Thank you for coming to share. It makes a difference, even if it's just a couple of us at a time. It makes a big difference.
That is true. I'm very true. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully. Okay, can y'all see my presentation? All right.
It is black right now, so give it I guess,
okay.
A couple seconds.
Let's see about this. Screen sharing can stop. Okay, let's try this one more time.
Getting with the new technology, not always easy.
There we go. I see it now.
Well, okay, cool. I have multiple screens, so it went to one screen. Okay, let me print. Oh, let me go. And I'm using Canva for the first time as a presentation, so.
Thank you for using Canva. That's what we teach all of our clients with barriers, and they are doing fabulous. I'm a PowerPoint person, so trying to switch over to Canva has been really exciting.
I didn't know that they did presentations. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, I was just saying I'm a professional designer, and I sometimes, a bunch of the social media posts you see in the group, I just use Canva to build them. It's so quick and easy.
Yeah, it's very easy, and I enjoyed using it. I was kind of nerding out and trying all the different things. So, okay. So welcome. This is financial compliance for grants. Jessica already went through my background, but I have experience with managing 6 million plus in federal and state grant awards. So very familiar with the ins and outs of the complexity and the reporting that come along with especially federal grants. Okay, so my part comes in. You've been awarded a grant. You've already done all the hard work of putting together the application, submitting it, and you've officially been awarded. So you get your grant letter or your contract, and now comes the part of spending the funds and making sure that you're monitoring those dollars right. So the main things that we're going to chat about are the budget, so your projected expenses, tracking grant expenses, your grant request for reimbursement, any reporting, and then your financial statements and your audit requirements. So for those, we'll start with the grant budget. So a grant budget is essential to have, just as you would for your normal operating budget for your organization. Every grant should have its own budget. Typically, this is set during the application process. So when you're submitting your application, typically funders want to have a grant application and a grant budget within the application. This should be a realistic budget based on your program. So I have seen some organizations that ask for $100,000 for a program that has one staff person that makes $40,000, and the expenses for that program maybe are 10. So realistically, they probably couldn't spend $100,000 in a year. They just asked for it because that was the max number that they could. So be realistic in what you think you can spend for that budget or that program. And this is going to be essential for helping you track your allowable expenses. So again, when you have it in the application, the funder is approved that during the application process. And so this is your basis for what is an allowable expense under that grant versus an unallowable expense. And typically funders want to see at the end of a grant cycle the actual to budget comparison. And so even if it's not a very strict grant and they just award you money, you get $50,000 for a program and they didn't require that you set a detailed budget, typically they want to see how you spent that $50,000 towards your budget. So this is just a quick example on the left here of what a simple program budget could be for a grant. And this is just in Excel, and it just shows this grant had 3 staff members on it and the total of the grant. And it's just something quick and easy that you can put in, but it also helps you track your expenses throughout the grant cycle. So tracking grant expenses. You should have very clear policies and procedures on how you are going to track your grant activity. This should, be set up in the finance department or with whoever does your financials, but also it should be with key staff. So key staff should understand how grants are tracked and how you monitor the expenses as an organization. And you should set up something within your accounting software that allows you to track grant expenses separately from other expenses. So I have a sample chart of account segments here, and you have your general ledger code, which is directly related to an expense account. And then depending on your software, you could have a fund code, and typically fund codes are grant codes. So you set a unique number for the new grant, and expenses that you incur on that grant will be charged to that fund code. And this just makes it to where when you pull reports out of your accounting system, you can just filter on that one unique number and pull it out, pull out the data. So you're not having to kind of put it in Excel and manipulate the data too much. Depending on your system, this could be a location code, it could be a department code, it could be its own expense code. It just depends on how your accounting system is set up and what options you have for setting up your different codes within your accounting system. But you should definitely have a unique number that is used for just that grant. So in past organizations, we've had 50 plus unique fund codes for all the different grants. And once that grant's done, you don't reuse that code. You just create a new one so that you always have that historical data. All right. Also with grant expenses, you have payroll and timekeeping. So most grants, especially on the federal side, go towards personnel costs. Some private grantors and foundations will allow you to do personnel costs. Most times, not necessarily, but if you do have a grant that has personnel on it, tracking your time and your payroll is going to be a very important part of making sure that you expense the right personnel costs to that grant. Again, you should set up your grant tracking through your payroll system. So however your payroll system is set up, usually there's a unique identifier code, just like we saw in the general ledger, that you can set a unique number for that, that grant time. If you don't have a very robust payroll system, or if your payroll system doesn't allow you to create unique codes, you can track this on a form in Excel, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. But essentially what you want to track for payroll and timekeeping is obviously the hours, but the hours need to be broken up into how the employee spent their time. So the employee spent their time on X grant and they did this for the payroll period. They spent 40 hours doing that, And then the employee and the supervisor both need to sign whatever tracking mechanism you use. Typically, if you're using a payroll and timekeeping system, this is done electronically. But if you're using an Excel document, then it'd be a hard signature. So here is an example of a time tracking form in Excel, pretty basic. So you have name, some basic information up here, the payroll, and I don't know how big it is on y'all screen. I have this as an Excel document. If you would like me to send it to you after the presentation, I can send it to you in Excel. It's pretty easier, a little easier to read. But over here you have the grant number, which again is that unique identifier for that grant. And then the activity worked is just what they did for that grant code for that pay period. Most times, if you have a personnel or a position that's on a grant, these activities don't change. So you try to keep it as basic as possible to where it encompasses everything that they're doing, but it's not so specific that they have to change it every pay period. So for like this example is just prepared client for client preparation time. And they would just put 8 hours, 4 hours, however long they did that. But they're not going into specifics of who they served or who they helped and how many people. It's just kind of a very broad activity. So at the end of the day, you would fill out this information. It would total to match their time card. And then the employee and the supervisor would sign this form. And this is just going to be used for your request for reimbursement at the end of the day. Okay. Also within your grant expenses, you have allowable and unallowable cost. This is particularly true when you get into federal grants. Some private funders will say you can't use this on personnel, you can't use this on overtime, or whatever the case may be. Federal grants have a lot more restrictions involved when it comes to allowable versus unallowable cost. So again, you should train key staff who are involved in this grant. That's finance, executive, and program staff on what is an allowable cost for this particular grant. You should read through the grant agreement and the contract to identify what is allowable and unallowable. And then for federal grants, usually those are defined during your contract. It's really important that you know these things after. Most funders are gracious if you submit something that's unallowable one time, 2 times maybe. But if it becomes a reoccurring habit of submitting costs that are unallowable on that grant, then that just jeopardizes your funding for future years. If you become that kind of like problem child for submitting your reimbursements. Most common unallowable expenses that I have seen that people try to do on grants are any entertainment expenses. Again, it depends on your programming and your organization. Some entertainment expenses might be fine, but often not. Entertainment expenses like taking a client out to dinner is just not something you'd put on a grant. Any fines or penalties, so if you have operating costs that are included on your grant, say a water bill, and you paid it late and you have a $20 late fee, most grants will not pay for that $20 late fee. They will just cover the standard amount of that invoice. Membership cost, again, it does depend on your organization and program, but if you're trying to have a membership cost to a country club as an organization, you do parties there, you host meetings there, most grants won't pay for membership costs like that. And certain travel costs, the big one is first class expenses or high-end hotels. Most grants, we all work in the nonprofit world, so most funds and funders and even donors don't want to see people traveling first class on their donations. So that one's usually a pretty big one. Yeah. So moving into grant requests for reimbursement. So most federal grants are reimbursable grants, meaning that you incur the cost up front, and then you submit an invoice to the funder for them to reimburse you for that grant funds. Private grants tend to be more of, we give you the money up front, and then at the end of the year, we just expect a report on how you spent the money and how your program went. So kind of two different things, but this is mainly talking to federal grants or maybe a state grant that you have that is a reimbursable. So if you have any grant that you have to incur the cost up front and submit for reimbursement, typically it's best to do that monthly. Again, that is defined in your agreement and your contract, how often they want to see your RFR. But usually most organizations like to see it monthly, and the deadlines are set within your agreement. So make sure you pay close attention to any deadlines that are in your agreement or contract, because that's what they hold you to for submitting these. If you have a reimbursement grant, just remember that that is directly tied to your cash flow. So if you incur expenses, you want to try to submit the reimbursement request in a timely manner to get that cash back in the door. So if you're having any kind of cash flow issues, really look at your grants. And if you have a reimbursement grant, make sure you're keeping up with that and you're submitting everything you can on that grant, because that directly offsets your cash flow. Here's a quick example of an RFR template. It's just very basic. It usually has the budget amounts that you've invoiced for previous months and a running total of your balance and how much you're asking for this month, how much you've asked for last month and your balance, and you typically sign it. This is one that you would send monthly to the grantor. This one just happened to be with the county. And typically with an RFR, again, this is all laid out in your agreement and your contract, but you would submit timesheets. If you have personnel on the grant, you would submit the personnel's pay stub, the employee's pay stub that's on the grant, any invoices and cleared checks that for those expenses that you're allowed to put on the grant, any type of tracking sheet. So like we kind of saw in the budget template, you would just track your expenses in Excel or on your general ledger, and you would submit that. And then you would submit this invoice template if they had one, and you would sign off on it. So that complete package for your RFR, your request for reimbursement, is what is going to help expedite your payment from the county, the state, the federal, the funder, whoever it might be. So if you're missing any of this, that just delays your payment from the funder. I apologize if I'm talking fast, but I know I have 15 minutes, so I'm getting to it, and we'll do questions at the end. So for reporting, reporting is a large component of any grant award, especially if you have federal or state grants. You have to do reporting, especially for federal and state. You have to do monthly reporting, quarterly reporting, and yearly reporting, not only on your financials, but on your program outcomes. So in most private funders that I've run across, at least require 2 reports, a mid-year report and a year-end report. So reporting is a big deal when it comes to grant funds. And this is just the grantor's way of keeping track of how the program's going, making sure you're tracking your goals, and on the financial side, making sure that you're expending those funds appropriately and in a timely manner. So most federal and state grants will have that you have to expend funds 50% by the middle of the grant, 100% by the end of the grant, and this is just their way of keeping up with them. A couple other things you have to track is if you have to match any funds for the grant. So if you have matching funds, typically these are by volunteer hours or funds you receive from the public. Then you have to track those matching funds and where they're coming from and how are you tracking that information. If your program earns money, so if you charge a fee for the service, you have to report your program income with your grant reporting. So again, it's just making sure that you identify that this program is earning money, and that's clearly defined on your general ledger. And then quarterly reports, I kind of talked about, but that's just ensuring, that's just the funder's way of knowing that you're on pace for your program and your financial goals that you've set. And one of the last things is just financial statements and audits. So a big question I get asked is, when do I need a single audit? Currently, per the uniform guidance, if you expend $750,000 or more in federal awards in a given fiscal year, you're required to obtain a single audit through an independent auditor. So as you go through an independent audit, if your organization does one, then that would be a separate component to the audit. So you would have your normal audit, year-end audit, and then you would have a single audit. And this is a single audit came about so that everybody is on the same page. Everybody is tested on the same information, and it is presented on your audited financials as a back part on the PDF. And that's just making sure that across the board, everybody is tested the same. And then for your audited financials, not every organization is required to have an independent audit. There are things that trigger an audit, and most of those include a grant application. So in my experience, I've seen organizations that want to apply for either a private grant or a federal grant or a state grant. And within that application process, it asks them to provide audited financial statements. Depending on your size, you could get around this, but more often than not, if you're a decent sized organization, they're going to require an audited financial statements. So something to keep in mind as you grow throughout your organization. And then to quickly recap, main things we talked about: budget, making sure you set a comprehensive and realistic budget for your grant. This should really be done when you're applying for the grant and talking about your program. Track your grant expenses is critical so that you don't jeopardize any future funding. Make sure you have a unique identifier in your accounting system that's linked to that grant for easy reporting. Submitting your monthly RFRs if you have a reimbursable grant will help with cash flow, and make sure you pay attention to deadlines. So if you have a grant, they give all of that information to you in the agreement and the contract, and they don't like to follow up with you to say, hey, this monthly report was due on the 15th and it's now the 20th. If you have too many of those, it puts you in jeopardy for them to fund you in the future. And just make sure you pay attention for when you're going to need a single audit if you are to the size where you expend $750,000 or more on federal funds. And most federal funds, that includes state and county funds. So I apologize, that was fast, but does anybody have any questions?
I do have a question. So you're tracking employees. What about your volunteers? Are you wanting to include that, like the hours that are given?
Yeah, you want to track your volunteer hours just in general for an organization, but mostly volunteer hours come in the form of matching funds.
Okay.
So if you're applying for, say, a state grant and they require you to match 50% of whatever your award is, you can use that with volunteer hours instead of having to put up public donations. So you'd want to track those, and then you can just add a dollar amount to them. That was applicable.
I really liked your spreadsheet. I'm a spreadsheetaholic, from groceries to t-shirts, whatever it is. Being a Special Olympics coach of everything they have here in Tennessee, I keep track of everything. So I love it. So I
Love
would
it.
love to have a copy of that so that I could
Sure.
try and design something for us from that. That looked really good.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to send you one.
Oh, if I put my email in the chat, is that?
Yeah, you can do that, or I can get it from Jessica after, whichever's easiest.
Okay, and you have a copy of the Zoom email, right?
Oh, yes, I do.
Yep, and
I
I'm
do. I
in,
can find your email through there.
yeah, Sally Herring at includemeadvocacygroup.com.
Yeah.
.org.
Okay.
We're now a .org. So,
And Sally, she'll be added to our group after
excellent.
we get after this call, so you can just directly connect with her on Facebook.
Everything you said was totally reminded me of everything for our grants at the Red Cross. So
Yeah.
I work with, I was working with military services. And so we had a lot of grants. So that went really well. I really liked your first two, or I think your third one, your payroll and timekeeping. I really like that. I think that's going to be the key for when the grants start rolling in.
Yeah, it's all about just making sure you have a clear identifier for what, expenses go to the grant versus general funds or another grant or anything.
Yeah, because as we're exploding, and we're getting larger every month, and we have been, and we're like the only agency in Tennessee that continued during COVID. Most of the other agencies doing on-the-job training with people with barriers, they kind of just, they're still not back. They're still not seeing any of their clients in person, where we have a little bit. But I keep on visioning, okay, 500 employees. Everything I do, 500 employees. So you don't really think of it when you're small. Definitely has to be in place now, because there's no way to go back and redo this at all.
Yeah, it's definitely harder to go back and do it.
Yeah, I appreciate your time very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you guys for having me.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, then I think we are done for the day. Thank you so much for your time, Melanie. As I said, I'll have you in the group to follow up with any other questions that people may come up with. And if that's all, have a good day, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.